Today's sermon is titled Lessons from a Tortoise, to be delivered by Nancy Tholen. Nancy Tholen grew up in a Los Angeles suburb with two sisters and a parade of pets, including the usual dogs, cats, parakeets, and fish, but also a cockatoo, various lizards, a wood-eating beetle, and of course, a tortoise or two. She joined our congregation 3 years ago, shortly after moving full-time to Cambria from Fresno. Welcome, Nancy.
Thank you, Dolores. Good morning, everyone. For more than 60 years, my family had a pet tortoise. I don't remember getting our pet tortoise. My family acquired it before I was a year old. My parents had moved to a tract house in a new development in Whittier, California, a month before I was born. I was a month late, too. My house was parallel to the railroad tracks, and trains could be seen through the houses across the street. The oft-told story of getting the tortoise was that my mom and sister were driving on that street on the other side of the train tracks when my sister exclaimed that a rock was moving. Lesson 1, listen to your children, even when they tell you the most outrageous things like a rock is moving. My mom pulled the car over and they got out to investigate. They found a desert tortoise with a broken cord tied through a hole drilled in its shell and a toothpick sticking out of its eye. Years later, I was lost in the foothills east of Stockton when my usually oblivious son said he knew where we were because he recognized a rock. He had driven 30 miles through rolling foothills. We had driven 30 miles through rolling foothills scattered with oak trees and boulders. But he remembered a rock? This was the same son who had driven up Highway 99, missing Fresno completely, and did not take the off-ramp to our house. I was not inclined to think that he recognized a rock he may have seen 2 or 3 times in his life, but I listened to him anyway. And he did indeed correctly find the rock and the county road that I was looking for. While I was still a baby, my family named the tortoise Gigi, based on the popular musical at the time starring Leslie Caron. My family loved musicals. I will never know if anyone thought there was a resemblance whatsoever between our mutilated tortoise and Leslie Caron, but I never saw one. Lesson 2. My mom had a penchant for rescuing injured animals and using herbal remedies. When I was a bit older, my mom told me that she had treated Gigi's eye with boric acid and herbs. Gigi was always blind, but the eyeball was saved. The hole in her shell through which the cord had been threaded eventually closed up over the years. As I was growing up, my house was the repository for many injured animals within blocks of our house. Kids I didn't even know would show up with some injured bird or something else, and my mom would usually manage to save it. It was an accepted fact in our family that some of the birds in the yard returned every year to nest. Remember the movie, The 3 Lives of Thomasina, about a girl with a cat, and the cat is, I think the father who's a vet tries to put the cat down to euthanize it, but then this beautiful woman who lives out in the woods saves the cat. I envisioned my mom as being like the healer character in the movie, rescuing animals, though looking nothing like the actress. At one point, I counted 22 animals at our house, in large part due to our dog having 5 puppies and the stray cat that we sheltered, literally having kittens at the same time. We had a regular menagerie when I was a child. In addition to the dogs, the series of parrots, those little terrapin turtles, and fish, we had a cockatiel, a series of ducks, lizards, and even the wood-eating beetle for 2 years. I always loved having a lot of pets. I was less enamored of my mother's herbal remedies. Years later, my own house became the neighbor's repository for animals that their cat had injured, or cats. There were a few birds and an opossum I tried to cure using what I'd learned from my mother. Of course, by then we also had Google, and I could augment her treatments. After a few days, though, I would turn them over to the local wildlife center. Aside from my mother's reputation for curing animals, my family was known in the neighborhood for our tortoise. Gigi would occasionally escape, and someone would inevitably bring her to our house. My dad would just glance at the tortoise and say, "Put her in the yard." Lesson 3, pay attention to subtle differences. All tortoises do not look alike. I could never understand why my dad could not immediately recognize that this was not our Gigi. To me, Gigi looked distinct. Sure, desert tortoises are all basically the same color, size, and shape, but they are subtle. There are subtle differences if one stopped and looked. Aside from the wonky eye, there were different marks on the shell. Because my dad did not try to learn what our tortoise looked like, we reached a point where we briefly had 4 tortoises. 4 tortoises are too many tortoises. If you pay attention, I found that even identical twins do not really look alike. There are subtle differences. I've never had any difficulty distinguishing between my friends or relatives that were supposedly identical. My dad's inability to distinguish our tortoise led to one of the more important lessons. Someone returned a strange tortoise to us when I was about 10 years old. To my surprise, Gigi kept trying to climb on this other tortoise and would nod her head incessantly at the newbie. I eventually learned that Gigi was not a girl tortoise, but rather a very horny male tortoise, boy tortoise. For 10 years, we all thought Gigi was female, but we were all wrong. Lesson 4, you might be wrong about someone's gender. If they let you know that they are a different gender, just accept it and move on, because it really doesn't matter. They are all the same being, and really nothing important has changed about them except your notion of what gender they belong to. Our tortoise still ate the same food, preferring red roses to anything else, still hibernated in the winter, still hung out in the same places. Really, nothing about our tortoise changed when we discovered she was a he. However, Gigi needed a new name, and because we then had a pair of amorous tortoises, I named them Bonnie and Clyde, again, based on a popular movie at the time, and they were pretty destructive. In recent years, as gender identity has become more fluid, and it seems many young people identify as non-binary or pangender, or even some as the opposite sex from what we had always supposed, I have thought about Gigi revealing herself to be a male, and it's been a bit easier to accept that I was wrong. Easier to adapt to a new name and to accept the plural pronouns. Although I have to admit that as an English major obsessed with grammar, using they in a singular object, it's just kind of with a singular verb, it's really been more challenging in practice than in concept. Lesson 5, tortoises don't care what you name them. They respond just the same. Our tortoise came running to the name Clyde. Nah, just kidding. It didn't care at all. Tortoises respond just the same, don't respond to their names, at least mine never did. The corollary lesson to that is number 6, lesson 6, listen very carefully. I looked for Clyde on a fairly regular basis. No sense in putting out lettuce in the hot Fresno sun if he wasn't going to eat it soon. After checking the usual places for Clyde, sometimes I would try to find him by listening for him. I would close my eyes and I'd hear the bird song and the hum of the bees, the wind in the leaves. I'd feel the sun. I absolutely never found Clyde this way, but it was a wonderful experience each time, and I have learned to just close my eyes and listen to my surroundings, even when not trying to locate a very quiet tortoise. I suggest you try it soon and often. Lesson 7, you can learn new things about someone you've known for 50 years. When I was about 50, my parents moved from my childhood home and took up residence in my sister's guest house. My sister lives on a 1-acre lot that is not fenced. so there was no way she could take Clyde. My other sister lived in an apartment, so I was the only option for keeping Clyde. Not keeping Clyde was never an option. I thought I knew about tortoises, having had 1 or 2 or 4 my whole life. My mom would put out various leftovers to augment the garden plants that Clyde ate in our yard. Standard fare was iceberg lettuce and corn tortillas. As a child, I was often enlisted to feed him, holding a piece of watermelon so that he could munch every last bit. We never gave him a dish of water, although I saw him drink occasionally from puddles. And we didn't concern ourselves with where he hibernated. He was the ultimate low maintenance pet. We did not fret about him at all. When I brought him to Fresno, I literally laughed when Robert suggested I take him to the vet. I thought it was so funny, I told the vet, and was surprised when he said he would love to see him. He had worked on a ranch in Texas for years and had a lot of tortoises under his care. He turned out to be a wealth of information about proper diet, giving the tortoise water, measuring him at the start and end of hibernation, explaining what to look for in terms of dehydration, urging me to register him with the state, etc. The doctor even offered to write a prescription for broccoli leaves so I could get some from the grocery store. The vet dismissed the idea that one could tell a tortoise's age by counting the number of grooves in the shell, which we had always thought, just like you count the rings in a tree. Doesn't work. I also did some research on the tortoise on the internet. I was amazed that Clyde had survived on the supposedly deficient diet my parents had provided, such as the ubiquitous iceberg lettuce, which is devoid of vitamins, and was warned, never feed to a tortoise. I also registered Clyde with the state and received an official gold metallic sticker that I affixed to his shell. Clyde was unimpressed by all the fuss, and he absolutely refused to eat the fresh organic broccoli leaves I got from a biologist friend. Likewise, I continued to learn about Robert, even after 40 plus years together. I find out new things about my older sister, who I've known even longer. I hope I've become more inquisitive and less of a know-it-all, but I'm not really sure. Lesson 8, take an occasional break from someone can be refreshing and increase appreciation. Having Clyde back in my life on a daily basis was fun at first. Although I enjoyed Clyde, and he was also a responsibility, another mouth to feed, more meals to plan. I have to admit that sometime around each October, I was ready for a break from him. A couple weeks after he started to hibernate in November, I'd put him in a box in the garage. The following March, I'd put his box back in the backyard and let spring do its magic. I was always very happy to see Clyde again when he started to stir. And I'd look forward to the months ahead of this prehistoric creature making his rounds in the yard. Visitors enjoyed him too. And I was happy to find things to feed him and to try to get him to drink water. I find that family too, much as I love them, I appreciate them more after we spend a bit of time apart. Fortunately, it only takes a few days apart for me to miss them, and my newfound appreciation lasts much longer than a few weeks. I'm sure they get a little tired of me too. Lesson 9, don't underestimate the seemingly insignificant. Clyde withdrew into his shell at the slightest provocation. He generally moved fairly slowly. He did not strike anyone as particularly smart. It was easy to ignore him. Although Clyde was about the size of a large dinner plate and only a few inches high, he was formidable in his own way. When I first brought him to Fresno to live with us, he immediately attacked our 100-pound golden retriever as the dog laid on the grass. Clyde pulled in his head, revealing this long protrusion of, you can kind of see on the lower shell, there's a plate that comes out more. And when he pulls his head, it's like this little battering ram. And the tortoise would run, in his own style, into the dog, into his side. And the dog would just sidle over a few inches and didn't even get up. This happened several times, and the dog finally moved over a few feet, got up. The dog was not hurt. I don't think Sutter, the dog, was concerned or frightened about Clyde. However, we did notice that Clyde quickly took over the doghouse. During the months Clyde was not hibernating, Sutter did not go into his beloved doghouse, even when Clyde wasn't in it. Uh-oh. There we go. I also underestimated how smart Clyde was. For example, we initially arrived in Fresno in the mid-afternoon. By the next day, he had found one of the gates out of the backyard where there was a low spot, and he was trying to escape, or he was trying to get into the front yard. I promptly moved him back to the middle of the lawn. We had a large yard. It was 150 feet across, with low fences, a deck, pathways, shrubs, trees, numerous flower beds. Nevertheless, once I put Clyde down, facing the wrong way, he made a beeline back to that same gate 100 feet away, going around the flower beds, over the path, around a corner, and went right to it. He evidently had learned our yard in under 24 hours. I have found, too, that people underestimated me throughout my life. My first grade teacher wanted me to repeat first grade. I was a puny kid. I didn't read or do math very well, and I was frequently picked on, but I learned to fight back. Lawyers also frequently underestimated me, assuming I was a dumb blonde and saying derogatory sexist things right into my face. I tried to ignore them as best I could and stay focused on the case and the law. I almost always won, and I enjoyed the shocked face expressions on some of my opponents' faces. I learned to not assume my opponent was as competent as they seemed, particularly the new lawyers and paralegals as I aged. I always treated them respectfully. I always prepared my cases assuming my opponent would see any weakness. It served me well. Once we brought Clyde to live with us in Fresno, it became apparent that he recognized me. Who knew? While he didn't exactly run to me like the dog, he definitely walked over to me unless he was napping somewhere. He also watched anyone who did work in our yard, and I mean, he would watch them for hours. I'm not sure what he thought. He would, however, try to escape if they left a gate open. Lesson 10. Even with wrinkly, saggy skin, numerous scars and imperfections, we are still beautiful to those who love us. I see pictures of Clyde with all his scars, his scaly, saggy skin, and I think he's beautiful. I was going to try to use a different tortoise's photograph here because it showed his sags a little better than my photo of Clyde, but I realized the other tortoise looked like a young Brad Pitt to me compared to my tortoise. With the other tortoise had the smoother scales and a perfect shell. Nicely colored too. But it wouldn't do. To be honest, I never actually enjoyed looking at Clyde's damaged eye. That's the good side. But it just was part of his painful past and added even more character. To me, Clyde was handsome. I liked it in his own kind of scraggly, rugged way. I like to think my friends see past my imperfections just as I am impervious to theirs. It really doesn't matter what we look like. We are lovable no matter how we look or how we age. Lesson 11. You'll miss them when they're gone. As we prepared to move to Cambria full-time, we knew we couldn't keep Clyde in our chilly paved backyard here. Both our daughter and niece wanted to take him, but they lived in apartments and would need to relocate before they had a place for him. I found him a temporary home with a woman who had multiple tortoises and fed them a banquet every day. She took him a month before we moved, and he seemed to enjoy his new surroundings, according to her reports and photos. About a year later, she let me know that Clyde died. I figured he was about 80 years old. or at least that old, because he was full grown when we found him 60 plus years earlier. While Clyde was never the most exciting, affectionate pet, I was heartbroken when I learned of his death. He did not do any tricks. He'd bite you if you didn't mind your fingers when feeding him, and he didn't snuggle up to you. In fact, he was easy to ignore, but none of that mattered. Robert bought me this tortoise statue before we moved, so I would always have a reminder of Clyde. I see it daily, and I think of Clyde fondly. He was a beloved family member, and I don't remember a time when he was not part of my family. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. I never had a tortoise. How many of you had tortoises? One. Wow, okay.